What if everything you believe, cause and effect, morality, even reason itself, is not based on certainty at all, but simply on habit? In the 18th century, a quiet Scottish philosopher began questioning whether humans truly understand the world or merely grow used to it. David Hume's ideas were so unsettling that they shook the foundations of science, religion, and philosophy, forcing future thinkers to rethink how knowledge itself is possible. David Hume was born on May 7, 1711, in Edinburgh, Scotland, at a time when Europe was undergoing profound intellectual transformation. The scientific revolution had already begun reshaping humanity's understanding of nature, while philosophers across the continent searched for new foundations of knowledge independent of religious authority. Scotland itself was entering what would later be called the Scottish Enlightenment, a remarkable period in which small cities produced thinkers who would influence economics, science, politics, and philosophy far beyond their borders. Into this environment came Hume, a child whose quiet temperament concealed one of the most radical minds in the history of philosophy. His family belonged to modest Scottish gentry. His father died when Hume was still young, leaving his mother to raise him and his siblings under conditions emphasizing discipline, education, and moral seriousness. From an early age, Hume demonstrated unusual intellectual curiosity. He entered the University of Edinburgh at approximately 12 years old, which was not uncommon at the time, studying classical literature, logic, and philosophy. Although officially enrolled in law to satisfy family expectations, his interests quickly moved elsewhere. Legal study failed to capture his imagination. Instead, he became fascinated with understanding how the human mind itself works. Unlike philosophers before him who asked what reality ultimately is, Hume began asking a different question. How do human beings come to believe anything at all? This shift would later make him one of the most disruptive thinkers of the Enlightenment. Rather than constructing grand systems explaining the universe, Hume turned inward toward human psychology, examining perception, habit, emotion, and belief as natural processes. During his late teenage years and early 20s, Hume experienced an intense intellectual crisis, sometimes described as a philosophical awakening. He withdrew socially, dedicating himself almost entirely to reading and reflection. He later described entering a state of exhaustion and anxiety caused by relentless thinking, suggesting that his search for understanding pushed him beyond emotional stability. Physicians advised travel and practical activity to restore health, leading Hume to temporarily abandon academic ambition. He spent time working as a merchant's assistant in France, though commercial life proved incompatible with his temperament. Yet this period abroad became decisive. Living in relative isolation in the French town of La Flèche, coincidentally the same place where René Descartes had studied nearly a century earlier, Hume began composing what he believed would revolutionize philosophy. Still in his 20s, he undertook the ambitious project of explaining human nature using methods inspired by scientific observation rather than metaphysical speculation. The result was his first major work, a treatise of human nature. Hume aimed to apply experimental reasoning to the study of the mind itself. Instead of assuming reason governed human behavior, he carefully observed experience and concluded something deeply unsettling. Human thought, he argued, does not operate primarily through rational certainty, but through habit and psychological association. According to Hume, all knowledge begins with impressions, the vivid sensory experiences of seeing, hearing, feeling, and perceiving the world. Ideas are merely faint copies of these impressions retained in memory and imagination. This seemingly simple claim carried enormous consequences. If every idea originates from experience, then concepts lacking observable origin must be questioned. Philosophical notions long treated as certain suddenly appeared unstable. Hume examined belief in causation, one of the foundations of science itself. People assume that events occur because one thing causes another. Fire causes heat. One billiard ball striking another causes motion. Yet Hume argued that causation is never directly observed. We see events occurring together repeatedly, but we never perceive the necessary power connecting them. The mind simply becomes accustomed to expecting one event after another through repetition. Cause and effect, therefore, arise from psychological expectation rather than logical proof. This conclusion shook Enlightenment confidence in reason. Even scientific laws, Hume suggested, rest ultimately upon habit formed through repeated observation rather than absolute certainty. The future resembles the past, not because logic guarantees it, but because human minds expect patterns to continue. Knowledge becomes probability rather than certainty. When the treatise was published in 1739, Hume expected intellectual recognition. Instead, the work passed almost unnoticed. He later remarked that it fell dead born from the press. The disappointment deeply affected him, yet forced an important realization. His arguments, though powerful, required clearer expression for broader audiences. Returning to Britain, Hume began rewriting and refining his ideas in more accessible essays. These writings explored morality, politics, religion, economics, and human emotion with remarkable clarity. Gradually, his reputation grew, not as an abstract metaphysician, but as a keen observer of human behavior. He argued that morality arises not from rational deduction, but from sentiment, the natural human capacity for sympathy and emotional response. People judge actions as good or bad because they feel approval or disapproval, not because reason alone dictates moral truth. This emphasis on emotion challenged centuries of philosophical tradition, placing reason above passion. Hume suggested instead that reason serves emotion. Reason helps calculate means, but desire determines ends. Human beings act not because logic commands them, but because feeling motivates action. This psychological realism made his philosophy both deeply modern and deeply controversial. At the same time, Hume developed growing skepticism toward religious claims grounded in miracles or supernatural explanation. Applying his empirical method consistently, he questioned whether testimony about miraculous events could ever outweigh uniform human experience of natural law. Such arguments earned suspicion from religious authorities and hindered his attempts to secure academic positions despite intellectual brilliance. By the early middle years of his life, David Hume had quietly begun transforming philosophy's direction. Rather than seeking certainty like Descartes or rational structure like earlier thinkers, he exposed the fragile psychological foundations beneath belief itself. Knowledge, morality, religion, and science were no longer treated as products of pure reason, but as outcomes of human nature operating within experience. The implications of his work were only beginning to unfold, and the intellectual shockwaves he created would soon provoke responses from philosophers across Europe who realized that if Hume were correct, certainty itself might be impossible. As David Hume moved into the next stage of his life, his intellectual confidence strengthened even as institutional recognition continued to elude him. Despite the originality of his thinking, universities in Britain remained cautious toward ideas perceived as religiously controversial. Academic appointments required reputations for theological reliability, and Hume's growing skepticism toward traditional religious arguments made many authorities uneasy. Repeated attempts to obtain professorships failed, not because of lack of ability, but because his philosophy was viewed as dangerously unsettling. Freed from academic obligation, yet frustrated by exclusion, Hume turned increasingly toward writing essays intended for educated general readers rather than specialists. This decision proved decisive for his influence. Instead of constructing dense philosophical systems accessible only to scholars, he explored questions of politics, economics, taste, morality, and social behavior in clear and elegant prose. His essays, moral and political, gained popularity across Britain and Europe, establishing him as one of the finest writers of his generation. During this period, Hume refined one of his most revolutionary insights concerning human understanding. He argued that belief itself is not the result of logical proof, but of psychological habit strengthened through repetition. When events consistently occur together, the mind forms expectation automatically. This process happens beneath conscious reasoning. People assume the sun will rise tomorrow not because they possess logical certainty, but because past experience conditions anticipation. What appears to be rational confidence is in fact mental custom. This analysis extended far beyond abstract philosophy. Hume recognized that everyday life depends upon assumptions that cannot be logically justified. Human beings must rely on expectation despite lacking ultimate proof. Rather than viewing this limitation as tragic, Hume accepted it as a natural feature of human existence. Complete skepticism may be intellectually possible, yet practical life restores belief through instinct and experience. After philosophical reflection ends, people return naturally to trusting memory, perception, and social interaction. Hume's attention increasingly shifted toward morality and human emotion. Earlier philosophers had attempted to ground ethics in divine command or rational law, but Hume approached moral judgment empirically. Observing human behavior, he concluded that moral approval arises from sympathy, the ability to share and respond emotionally to the experiences of others. When individuals witness generosity or cruelty, they feel approval or discomfort instinctively. Morality therefore grows from shared human sentiment rather than abstract reasoning. This position radically altered ethical thought. If morality depends upon emotional response shaped by social life, then ethical systems emerge from human nature itself rather than universal rational principles imposed from outside. Cooperation, justice, and kindness develop because societies cannot function without mutual concern. Moral rules evolve gradually through experience as communities discover behaviors that sustain stability and well-being. At the same time, Hume explored political philosophy with remarkable moderation compared to many thinkers of his age. Living in a Britain still shaped by civil war and political upheaval, he rejected extreme ideological positions. Governments, he argued, succeed not because of theoretical perfection, but because they maintain order and public confidence. Political authority ultimately rests upon habit and opinion rather than pure legitimacy. People obey institutions largely because they're accustomed to doing so. Perhaps nowhere did Hume's skepticism appear more controversial than in his examination of religion. Applying his empirical standards consistently, he questioned whether belief in miracles could ever be rationally justified. Testimony describing supernatural events, he argued, must be weighed against overwhelming experience confirming the regularity of natural law. Since human testimony is frequently mistaken or exaggerated, belief in miracles requires accepting something less probable over something more probable. His argument did not always deny religion directly, but it placed extraordinary claims under demanding scrutiny. These views contributed to his reputation as a religious skeptic, limiting professional advancement, yet increasing intellectual notoriety. Critics accused him of undermining faith and morality, while admirers praised his intellectual honesty. Hume himself remained calm amid controversy, maintaining a temperament notably cheerful compared to the anxiety often associated with philosophical doubt. Friends frequently described him as sociable, humorous, and emotionally balanced, a striking contrast to the radical implications of his thought. In the 1750s, Hume accepted employment as librarian to the Faculty of Advocates in Edinburgh. Though modest in status, the position granted access to one of the finest libraries in Scotland. Surrounded by historical materials, he began composing a massive multi-volume history of England. The project occupied many years and unexpectedly brought him greater financial success and public fame than his philosophical writings. His historical work presented political events with analytical detachment, emphasizing economic forces, human motives, and institutional development rather than heroic narrative. The success of his historical writings transformed Hume's social standing. Once excluded from academic life, he became widely respected as historian and man of letters. Intellectual circles across Europe recognized him as a central figure of the Enlightenment. Yet beneath this growing recognition remained the quiet philosophical revolution he had initiated. By demonstrating that belief, morality, and knowledge arise from psychological processes rather than rational certainty, Hume had introduced a challenge that future philosophers could not ignore. Among those deeply shaken by Hume's conclusions was a young German thinker named Immanuel Kant, who later admitted that Hume awakened him from dogmatic slumber. If causation and certainty rested only on habit, then the foundations of science and metaphysics required reconsideration. The next generation of philosophy would emerge largely as a response to the problems Hume exposed. By this stage, David Hume had moved from intellectual outsider to influential public figure, yet his most profound impact remained philosophical. He had forced Europe to confront an unsettling possibility: the human reason may be less powerful than previously believed, and that understanding humanity requires studying the mind not as a perfect rational instrument, but as a natural phenomenon shaped by experience, emotion, and custom. As David Hume entered the mature period of his life, he had already achieved something unusual among philosophers. While many thinkers gained recognition only after death, Hume witnessed his reputation steadily grow during his own lifetime. His writings circulated widely across Britain, France, and the broader European intellectual world, placing him at the center of Enlightenment conversation. Yet this success came through an unexpected path. It was not his philosophical skepticism that first earned widespread admiration, but his historical and literary achievements, which introduced his ideas indirectly to readers who might otherwise have resisted them. His History of England became one of the most widely read historical works of the 18th century. Written with clarity and narrative balance, it departed from patriotic storytelling common at the time. Hume attempted to understand political conflict through human motivation rather than moral judgment. Kings, revolutionaries, and religious leaders appeared not as heroes or villains, but as individuals shaped by circumstance, ambition, fear, and belief. This approach reflected his broader philosophical conviction that human behavior must be explained psychologically rather than morally condemned or idealized. Financial success from the history allowed Hume a level of independence rare among intellectuals. Free from economic pressure, he moved comfortably within Edinburgh's intellectual society, becoming a central figure in what later historians would call the Scottish Enlightenment. Thinkers such as Adam Smith, who would later transform economics, counted Hume among their closest friends. Their conversations explored commerce, ethics, human cooperation, and social development, reinforcing the Enlightenment belief that society could be understood scientifically through observation of human behavior. Despite social success, Hume never abandoned philosophical inquiry. He continued refining earlier arguments concerning belief and knowledge, increasingly emphasizing the limits of reason. He argued that reason alone cannot motivate action. Logical understanding may inform decisions, but desire and sentiment ultimately move human beings to act. This claim reversed centuries of philosophical hierarchy, placing rationality above emotion. For Hume, emotion was not weakness, but the driving force of life itself. He extended this insight into aesthetics and taste, asking why people experience beauty differently while still sharing certain standards of judgment. Rather than assuming beauty exists objectively within objects, Hume suggested that aesthetic appreciation arises through cultivated sensitivity shaped by experience and education. Good judgment develops gradually as individuals refine perception through exposure and reflection. Even artistic evaluation, therefore, depend upon human psychology rather than fixed universal rules. During the early 1760s, Hume accepted a diplomatic position in Paris as secretary to the British Embassy. His arrival in France marked one of the most socially vibrant periods of his life. Parisian intellectual society welcomed him enthusiastically. Philosophers, writers, and aristocrats admired both his intellect and his gentle personality. Unlike the stereotype of the severe philosopher, Hume possessed warmth, humor, and conversational ease. He became a celebrated figure in salons where Enlightenment thinkers gathered to debate science, politics, and religion. Among those he encountered was Jean-Jacques Rousseau, whose emotional and passionate philosophy contrasted sharply with Hume's calm skepticism. Initially, Hume admired Rousseau and later assisted him in seeking refuge in Britain during political exile. However, the relationship deteriorated dramatically when Rousseau developed suspicion that Hume was secretly mocking or betraying him. The conflict became public and deeply uncomfortable for Hume, who valued friendship and moderation. Though he defended himself carefully, the episode revealed the emotional volatility present even within intellectual circles devoted to reason. Returning to Britain after his diplomatic service, Hume resumed a quieter life in Edinburgh. By this time, his philosophical influence had spread widely, though controversy remained attached to his religious skepticism. Some readers interpreted his work as undermining belief entirely, while others saw him as promoting intellectual humility rather than disbelief. Hume himself maintained measured distance from dogmatic positions, often presenting arguments through dialogue or indirect reasoning rather than direct declaration. One of his later philosophical works, Dialogues Concerning Natural Religion, examined traditional arguments for the existence of God through fictional conversation among characters representing different perspectives. Rather than delivering final conclusions, Hume exposed weaknesses within attempts to prove divine design purely through observation of nature. The work demonstrated his mature philosophical style, careful, ironic, and exploratory rather than confrontational. Aware of potential controversy, he chose not to publish it during his lifetime. Throughout these years, Hume's personal character continued surprising those who expected philosophical skepticism to produce despair. Friends consistently described him as cheerful, generous, and emotionally stable. He enjoyed conversation, dining, and companionship, embodying his belief that philosophy should align with ordinary human life rather than withdraw from it. Skepticism, for Hume, did not destroy meaning but moderated excessive certainty. By the later stage of his life, Hume had become one of Europe's most respected intellectual figures. Yet beneath social recognition remained the quiet radicalism of his thought. He had demonstrated that human knowledge rests not upon absolute proof, but upon psychological processes shaped by experience. Reason, once considered humanity's supreme authority, appeared limited and dependent upon instinct. The philosophical consequences of this realization continued spreading, preparing the ground for future thinkers who would attempt either to answer or escape the challenges he had raised. As age advanced, Hume faced the final phase of life with the same calm curiosity that had guided his philosophical inquiry. Approaching mortality not with fear, but with reflective composure shaped by a lifetime spent examining the nature of belief itself. As David Hume entered the final years of his life, he had achieved a rare position among philosophers. He was no longer the overlooked young thinker whose first great work had been ignored, but one of the most respected intellectual figures in Britain and across Europe. His home in Edinburgh became a gathering place for scholars, writers, economists, and political thinkers who regarded him not only as a philosopher, but as a model of intellectual balance. What distinguished Hume in the eyes of many contemporaries was not merely the boldness of his ideas, but the harmony between his philosophy and his character. While his writings questioned certainty, religion, and rational authority, his personal life reflected calmness, sociability, and emotional steadiness. In 1769, after years spent abroad in diplomatic service and public intellectual life, Hume permanently settled in Edinburgh. Financially secure from the success of his historical writings, he lived comfortably, surrounded by books, friends, and ongoing conversation. Unlike many philosophers who retreated into isolation, Hume remained deeply engaged with society. He enjoyed walks through the city, shared meals with companions, and participated actively in Scotland's vibrant intellectual culture. Observers often noted the contrast between the radical skepticism of his philosophy and the warmth of his personality. He laughed easily, avoided bitterness, and showed little interest in personal rivalry. During this period, Hume gradually organized his philosophical legacy. He revised earlier essays, prepared works for future publication, and reflected on the controversies his ideas had generated. Although criticism from religious authorities had followed him throughout life, he showed little resentment. His skepticism had never aimed to destroy belief for its own sake, but to encourage intellectual humility. Human understanding, he believed, must recognize its limits while continuing practical life guided by experience and shared sentiment. Perhaps the most remarkable aspect of Hume's final years was his attitude toward death. In 1775, he began suffering from a serious illness, likely intestinal cancer. As his condition worsened, friends expected anxiety or spiritual crisis, particularly given accusations that his philosophy undermined religious faith. Instead, witnesses reported extraordinary composure. Hume discussed his approaching death openly, sometimes even humorously, displaying neither fear nor dramatic repentance. His close friend Adam Smith later described visiting Hume during these final months and finding him cheerful, engaged in conversation, and intellectually curious despite physical decline. Hume treated death as a natural event rather than metaphysical terror. Since human knowledge could not extend beyond experience, speculation about an afterlife held little philosophical certainty. What mattered instead was the life already lived, shaped by friendship, inquiry, and moderation. Shortly before his death, Hume wrote a brief autobiographical sketch titled My Own Life. In it, he summarized his existence with striking simplicity, describing himself as a man of mild temperament, steady industry, and social affection. There was no attempt to defend his philosophy or dramatize his achievements. The tone reflected acceptance rather than self-importance. He seemed satisfied that he had pursued understanding honestly, regardless of controversy. David Hume died on August 25, 1776, at the age of 65. News of his peaceful death spread widely, provoking both admiration and discomfort. Critics who had predicted despair at life's end found instead an example of philosophical calm. Supporters viewed his composure as evidence that intellectual skepticism need not destroy moral character or emotional stability. In the years following his death, Hume's influence expanded dramatically. Philosophers across Europe recognized that his analysis of causation, belief, and human psychology posed challenges impossible to ignore. Most famously, Immanuel Kant later acknowledged that Hume awakened him from dogmatic slumber, forcing reconsideration of how knowledge itself is possible. Entire philosophical movements emerged in response to questions Hume had raised about certainty and experience. Modern philosophy, psychology, economics, and cognitive science all carry traces of Hume's insight that human reasoning operates through habit, emotion, and association rather than pure logic alone. His understanding of sympathy anticipated later theories of moral psychology. His skepticism toward absolute certainty influenced scientific humility and empirical investigation. Even contemporary discussions about perception, probability, and decision-making reflect problems he articulated centuries earlier. Yet perhaps Hume's deepest legacy lies in his vision of humanity. He portrayed human beings not as perfectly rational creatures guided solely by logic, nor as fallen beings dependent entirely on authority, but as natural organisms shaped by feeling, experience, and social connection. Knowledge becomes possible not through certainty, but through shared practice. Society functions because sympathy binds individuals together despite intellectual limitation. David Hume transformed philosophy by turning attention away from abstract, metaphysical systems toward the study of human nature itself. Instead of asking what reality must be in theory, he asked how human beings actually think, believe, and live. In doing so, he replaced the search for absolute certainty with a quieter but more enduring understanding, that wisdom may consist not in conquering doubt, but in learning to live thoughtfully within it. His life closed without dramatic revelation, yet the questions he left behind continue shaping modern thought. Every time humanity examines belief, questions causation, or recognizes the role of emotion and judgment, the influence of Hume quietly remains, guiding inquiry toward humility, observation, and acceptance of the limits that define human understanding.